Hello. In this video, we will look at a political movement that was highly influential on cultural studies, and this movement is known as the New Left. The New Left is a term that refers to various movements by artists, intellectuals, and students in North America and Western Europe mostly during the 1950s and the 1960s. So it is not a single movement, but rather there are various interconnected movements, or sometimes they are just independent movements, but they all have a common ideological thread that connects them. So this entire group of movements that happened in many different countries in Europe, in Britain, in North America, all these happened, and they were mostly movements by artists, intellectuals, and students. The umbrella term used to refer to all these movements is called the New Left, and it was mostly during the 1950s and 60s, and even to a certain extent to around 1970. This is the time when the New Left movements were extremely popular. New Left എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ തന്നെ നമുക്കറിയാം, left basically refers to a movement that believes in leftist ideals, Marxist or communist ideals. And when you say New Left, then you are also assuming that there is an old left. So the orthodox Marxism or the traditional Marxism was considered to be the old left, and the new left was composed of people who still believed in some ideals of Marxism but were not very happy with the ways in which orthodox Marxism was going, and therefore they called themselves the new left. They searched for a third way. This is a term that is usually used in reference to the new left. They searched for a third way other than orthodox Marxism and social democracy. അപ്പോൾ ആ സമയത്ത് ഒരു പ്രോഗ്രസീവ് സൊസൈറ്റിക്ക് പറ്റിയ രണ്ട് പാത്ത്സ് ആയിട്ട്, ഒരു പ്രോഗ്രസീവ് ടു പാത്ത്സ് ടുവേർഡ്സ് പ്രോഗ്രസീവ് സൊസൈറ്റി എന്ന് കണ്ടിരുന്ന രണ്ട് കാര്യങ്ങളായിരുന്നു. ഒന്ന് ഓർത്തഡോക്സ് മാർക്സിസം, ഒരു കമ്മ്യൂണിസ്റ്റ് രീതിയിൽ പോവുക എന്നുള്ളത്. ആൻഡ് ദിസ് വാസ് ഓൾസോ ടൈം യു ഷുഡ് റിമെമ്പർ വെൻ ആഫ്റ്റർ ദ റഷ്യൻ റെവല്യൂഷൻ, റഷ്യ and many other countries had communist governments. The Cold War was going on. All this was going on, and there was a general disillusionment with how orthodox Marxism was shaping up. So orthodox Marxism ഒരു രീതിയിൽ, and many European countries were also going for a what is called a social democracy, which however was influenced a lot by capitalism. അപ്പോൾ ആ ഓർത്തഡോക്സ് മാർക്സിസവും അല്ല സോഷ്യൽ ഡെമോക്രസിയും അല്ലാത്ത ഒരു തേർഡ് വേ ആണ് നമ്മുടെ ന്യൂ ലെഫ്റ്റ് ആഗ്രഹിച്ചിരുന്നത്. And some of the important issues, we said that these are actually movements. It is not like one single movement with a clear ideology or anything like that, or clear leadership or anything. There were many small movements, and however there were some issues that were common to many of them, and these issues included anti-war stances. So this was the time, as I already mentioned, the Cold War was going on, and there were also many other kinds of wars like the Vietnam War, and many other kinds of wars were going on, Korean War. So most of these movements were against war. They were opposed to war. So anti-war stances connected many of these movements. Then opposition to nuclear weapons. There was a lot of concern about the nuclear race that was going on between the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc during the Cold War. So everybody was scared that this will lead to some kind of a terrible nuclear disaster or a nuclear war, and especially after the utilization of the nuclear bomb during the Second World War in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because of all this, there was a very strong campaign that was coming up from progressive circles towards nuclear disarmament. Disarmament means nuclear armament, nuclear weapons ഒഴിവാക്കുക, അത് ഇല്ലാതാക്കുക എന്നുള്ളൊരു സംഭവം. And that was also this kind of opposition to nuclear weapons was also supported by the new left. Then they also worked for civil and political rights. Civil rights movements for blacks and for other ethnic minorities were going on. They supported feminism and gay rights, They supported the right to abortion, which was still not given for many women at that time. Women did not have that kind of control over their own bodies. Abortion was considered a sin and also a legal crime in many countries. So these movements supported the right to abortion, saying that a woman should have control over her own body and be able to decide whether or not to have a child that was conceived, sometimes maybe not with her own consent. So right to abortion. Then of course gender equality and gender roles was something that they were interested in. Drug policy reforms, etc. So all these were important issues that the new left was concerned with. And as I already mentioned, the new left was composed of activist students and intellectuals who were disillusioned with the traditional left. And this was especially in the context of the repressive policies of Stalinism. Joseph Stalin, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at that time, people came to realize that whatever the ideals of communism were in the initial days of the the formation of the Soviet Union, they had become it had become an extremely cruel and authoritarian regime, a totalitarian regime, a kind of dictatorship under Joseph Stalin. So the repressive policies of Stalinism were something that completely disillusioned the new left. Again, during that time there were many other countries that had very authoritarian communist governments, mostly supported by the Soviet Union as part of this Cold War, and Hungary and even Czechoslovakia were some of these countries. And in 1956 there was a Hungarian revolution where the people actually tried to rebel against the dictatorial policies of the communist Hungarian government, but the government suppressed this revolt, this revolution very cruelly, and that government was also, the Hungarian government was also backed by the Soviet Union. And when this happened, the communist parties of UK and USA were completely silent about it because they did not know how to react. On the one hand, this is a communist state and they could not go against the communist state. On the other hand, this was an extremely cruel and authoritarian way of shutting down the people's revolution. So the traditional communist parties of UK, USA, etc. could not react to the cruel governmental response to the Hungarian revolution, and this was again something that disillusioned the new left. The new left therefore rejected the Soviet model of communism as authoritarian and dogmatic. So orthodox communism is dogmatic. It depends too much on dogmas. It depends too much on certain very rigid principles എന്നാണ് ന്യൂ ലെഫ്റ്റ് വിശ്വസിച്ചിരുന്നത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ ആ സോവിയറ്റ് മോഡലിലുള്ള കമ്മ്യൂണിസം അവർ കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ആയിട്ട് റിജക്റ്റ് ചെയ്തു. And it's not just the practical application of communism that they had a problem with, they also disavowed certain very important principles of Marxism like class struggle and dialectical materialism. So traditional Marxism or the old left considered class to be the basis of social struggles. There is a proletariat and there is a bourgeoisie, and it is a fight between them. That is what the old left believed. But instead of that, the new left extended the definition of oppression beyond class to include gender, sexuality, race, and other factors. And therefore they said it is not enough to consider class to be the basis of social struggles. We should look at many other kinds of oppression and marginalization that people are facing, and we should fight against those. One of the most important figures of the new left is Herbert Marcuse. He was part of a school called the Frankfurt School, and he is considered to be the father of the new left. And Herbert Marcuse has famously remarked that material issues related to class struggle have been resolved. He said there is no point talking about class struggle anymore. Maybe it was relevant during the 19th century when Marx was talking about it at the peak of industrialization, when workers did not have many rights. So the trade union movement, all those were relevant, but he was saying that by the 1950s and 60s they had lost their relevance because many of those problems had already been solved through legislation. and therefore the new problems that existed in society are not material or economic in nature, or even if they are economic in nature, they are usually motivated by other factors which may be ideological rather than material, and therefore the new problems require new solutions. So the old model of communism was supposed to be a solution to the class struggle between the proletariats and the capitalists. However, that problem no longer exists in exactly the same way, and therefore we need to have new solutions for our new problems. That is what the new left believed. Now, apart from Western Europe and North America, new left movements also rose up in Asian and African countries. However, these movements were fundamentally different from the new left movements in Europe and America, because the political opponents of these new left movements, that is, the ones in Asian and African countries, were foreign rulers, dictators, puppet governments, or crony capitalist governments. Many of these Asian and African countries were still undergoing colonialism, and they were involved in anti-colonial struggles at that time. So sometimes their opponents were not capitalists per se, but they were foreign rulers. Some of them had gained independence, but they were being ruled by dictators, and therefore their opponents were their own dictatorial governments. Sometimes their governments were puppet governments for other politically powerful countries, or for crony capitalist regimes, and therefore those were considered to be their opponents. So this was one of the fundamental differences between the new left movements in Asian and African countries as opposed to the new left movements in Europe and America. And despite their differences with orthodox Marxism, the new left accepted the original principles of Marx regarding the evils of capitalism and the need for reorganizing society. Therefore, even though some people think that the new left is a break with the old left, it is a completely different thing. Some other people also hold that the new left is the logical continuation of the old left. Old ലെഫ്റ്റിൻ്റെ വളരെ ബേസിക് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു കോൺസെപ്റ്റ്, അതായത് ക്യാപിറ്റലിസം സൊസൈറ്റിക്ക് വളരെ മോശമാണ്, അത് ഒപ്രസീവ് ആണ് എന്നും, സൊസൈറ്റീനെ കംപ്ലീറ്റ്ലി റീഓർഗനൈസ് ചെയ്ത് സൊസൈറ്റിയിൽ എല്ലാവരും തമ്മിൽ ഒരു ഈക്വാലിറ്റി ഉണ്ടാക്കണം എന്നുള്ള ആ ഒരു ബേസിക് സംഭവം ന്യൂ ലെഫ്റ്റ് ആക്സെപ്റ്റ് ചെയ്തിരുന്നു. അത് മാർക്സിസത്തിൽ നിന്ന് അവർ കിട്ടിയതാണ്. പക്ഷേ അത് ഏത് രീതിയിൽ, വാട്ട് ഈസ് ദ ഗൈഡിങ് പ്രിൻസിപ്പിൾ ഫോർ ദ സോഷ്യൽ റീഓർഗനൈസേഷൻ, അത് ക്ലാസ് ആവണോ മറ്റെന്തെങ്കിലും ആവണോ എന്നുള്ള കാര്യത്തിൽ അവർ ഡിഫർ ചെയ്തു. അതുപോലെ ഏത് രീതിയിൽ, ഇൻ വാട്ട് way should communism come into being, that was also something that they disagreed about. So that is the difference between new left and the old left, but at the same time there is also a very deep connection between the two. Now, if you look at some of the important thinkers who influenced the new left, there were many people. There is, as I already mentioned, the new left is not a single movement with a single leader or a set of leaders. There were many different kinds of movements can come under this, and there are a lot of people who influence the new left. Some of the important influences are Jean-Paul Sartre, E.P. Thompson, Leon Trotsky, Mao Zedong, Louis Althusser, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and Ho Chi Minh. These are some of the important influences, but there were also many other important influences on the new left. And now let us come to the impact of the new left on humanities, on literature, and on cultural studies, because that is the most important aspect as far as we are concerned. Cultural studies received a new impetus from the new left, which had initiated new research and inquiries into issues affecting the marginalized and the minorities. അപ്പോൾ ന്യൂ ലെഫ്റ്റ് വാസ് കൺസേൺഡ് വിത്ത് മാർജിനലൈസ്ഡ് ആൻഡ് ദ മൈനോറിറ്റീസ്. അവരുടെ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് എന്താണ്, അവരുടെ ഇഷ്യൂസ് എന്താണ്, അതിലേക്ക് ഒരുപാട് എൻക്വയറീസ്, റിസർച്ച് ഒക്കെ നടത്തി തുടങ്ങിയിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. Cultural studies was also concerned with the problems of the working class, but also of the different types of minorities, minority cultures or marginal cultures that existed in a society. Dominant ആയിട്ടുള്ള കൾച്ചർ മാത്രമല്ല, മൈനോറിറ്റീസിൻ്റെ കൾച്ചറിനും ഇമ്പോർട്ടൻസ് കൊടുക്കണമെന്ന് വിശ്വസിച്ചിരുന്നവരാണ് കൾച്ചറൽ സ്റ്റഡീസ് സ്കോളേഴ്സ്. ആൻഡ് ദെയർഫോർ there was a natural affinity between cultural studies and the new left. അപ്പോൾ ന്യൂ ലെഫ്റ്റ് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് കൾച്ചറൽ സ്റ്റഡീസിനെ നല്ലോണം ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. Now, as far as literature and the study of the arts were concerned, the themes and concerns of these disciplines were reoriented to include burning socio-political issues like inequality, deprivation, and dehumanization. So, before that, literature was mostly concerned with either with the canonical texts or with great philosophical questions about humanity or beautiful things, the aesthetics of writing, etc. ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ ആണെങ്കിലും ആർട്സ് ലൈക്ക് പെയിൻറ്റിങ്, സ്കൾപ്ചർ അങ്ങനെയുള്ളതാണെങ്കിലും ശരി, വളരെ ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ളതും വളരെ ഗ്രേറ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങളെ പറ്റിയിട്ടായിരുന്നു മാത്രമാണ് ചർച്ച ചെയ്തിരുന്നത്. പക്ഷേ ഈ ന്യൂ ലെഫ്റ്റിൻ്റെ ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് കൊണ്ടാണ് ആ ലിറ്ററേച്ചറിൻ്റെയും ആർട്സിൻ്റെയും സെൻട്രൽ കൺസേൺസ് ചെറുതായി റീഓറിയൻറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് അതിൽ നമുക്ക് സോഷ്യോ പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ ഇഷ്യൂസ്, കണ്ടംപററി ആ സമകാലികമായ ആ കാലത്തെ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് എന്തൊക്കെയാണ്, സോഷ്യൽ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് എന്താണ്, പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് എന്തൊക്കെയാണ്, അതിനെ പറ്റിയും കൂടി ലിറ്ററേച്ചറിലും ആർട്സിലും വളരെ ഡീറ്റെയിൽ ആയിട്ട് വളരെ സെൻട്രലായി നമ്മൾ ചർച്ച ചെയ്യണം എന്ന് ഡിസൈഡ് ചെയ്ത ഒരു സമയമായിരുന്നു. So social inequality, deprivation, dehumanization, all this was experienced by a great set of people, by many groups of people, various groups of people in society, on the basis of race, on the basis of class or caste, on the basis of religion, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexuality, and many other aspects. And all this should be studied. ഇന്ന് കാലത്ത് നമ്മൾ ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ പഠിക്കുമ്പോൾ ഇതെല്ലാം വളരെ നോർമലായി നമ്മൾ പഠിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, ഇതെല്ലാം ലിറ്ററേച്ചറിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമായി തന്നെ നമ്മൾ പഠിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. പക്ഷേ എല്ലാ കാലത്തും അങ്ങനെ ആയിരുന്നില്ല. അങ്ങനെ ആയി വരാനുള്ള വലിയ ഒരു ഇൻഫ്ലുവൻസ് ന്യൂ ലെഫ്റ്റ് ആയിരുന്നു. Then the student revolution of May 1968 in Paris was also influenced by the new left. 1960s ഒരുപാട് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്സ്, ഹിപ്പി മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു, വേറെ ഒരുപാട് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് യൂറോപ്പിലും മറ്റ് സ്ഥലങ്ങളിലും സംഭവിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. മെനി കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് ആർട്ടിസ്റ്റിക് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് ആസ് വെൽ ആസ് പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് ഹാപ്പൻ. ദർ എക്സിസ്റ്റൻഷ്യൽ മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അങ്ങനെ പല മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അതിൽ ഏറ്റവും ഇമ്പോർട്ടൻ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ളത് May 1968 പാരീസിൽ സംഭവിച്ച സ്റ്റുഡൻറ്റ് റെവല്യൂഷൻ, വിച്ച് ഓൾസോ ലെഡ് ടു എ വർക്കേഴ്സ് റെവല്യൂഷൻ, and that really influenced the history of youth struggles all over the world and the history of political struggles all over the world. അത്രയും ഇമ്പോർട്ടൻ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ഇവൻ്റാണ് May 1968 സ്റ്റുഡൻറ്റ് റെവല്യൂഷൻ ഓഫ് പാരീസ്. ആൻഡ് ദാറ്റ് revolution, that event was also influenced by the new left. So this is the legacy of the new left. And the new left movements were mostly active from the 1950s through the 1970s and gradually waned in influence. May 1968 that was maybe, it can be considered the peak of the impact of the new left. But after that, slowly this movement, the influence of this movement gradually lessened, gradually waned. And later many of these movements also solidified to form political parties rather than being oppositional movements in society. Many of them also formed political parties. അത് ഫോർ എക്സാമ്പിൾ നമ്മുടെ നാട്ടിലൊക്കെയുള്ള നക്സലൈറ്റ് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ് നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ ഗവൺമെൻറ്റിനെതിരെ അതുപോലെ ക്യാപിറ്റലിസ്റ്റുകൾക്കും ഫ്യൂഡൽ ലാൻഡ് ലോഡ്സിനൊക്കെ എതിരെ ഫൈറ്റ് ചെയ്തിരുന്ന ഒരു ഒപ്പോസിഷണൽ ഫോഴ്സ് ആയിരുന്നു നക്സലൈറ്റ് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്. പക്ഷേ അത് ആ നക്സലൈറ്റ് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്, അതായത് ഞാൻ ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്നത് ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ മാവോയിസ്റ്റുകളല്ല, ബട്ട് ഒരു 1970s 60s 70s ഉണ്ടായിരുന്ന നക്സലൈറ്റ് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ്, നക്സൽ ബാരി മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ് നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ, ഹവെവർ അതിൽ വളരെ പ്രോമിനൻ്റായി നിന്നിരുന്ന പല ആളുകളും പിന്നീട് പൊളിറ്റിക്സിൽ ചേരുക, പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ പാർട്ടീസ് തുടങ്ങുക, ആ രീതിയിലൊക്കെ പോയിട്ടുണ്ട്. സോ ദെൻ ദാറ്റ് മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ് ഓൾസോ ലൂസസ് ഇറ്റ്സ് ഇംപെറ്റസ് ഇൻ എ വേ. So that is also what happened to the new left movement. However, as you can see from this very brief discussion of the new left, it was a movement that had a profound influence on cultural studies and on the study of literature and the arts.